They were never supposed to win, not by any logic, not by any measure. One team was forged in the fires of discipline, sharpened by the cold steel of the Soviet state, unbeatable for over a decade. The other? A ragtag crew of American college kids, unknown, untested, and wildly unprepared for the storm they were skating into. But something happened in 1980. It wasn't just a game. It wasn't even just an upset. It was a rupture, a moment when belief beat certainty, when chaos overpowered control, when the impossible became American. This is the story of how that happened, of the quiet doubts and the brutal practices, of the men who wore red not just as a uniform, but as an identity, and of the boys who stood against them, with nothing but skates, sweat, and something they couldn't explain. You've heard the final score, you've seen the highlight, but you've never lived the story like this. So lean in, because this isn't just about hockey. It's about Cold War tension, broken systems, hidden poems, late-night locker room laughter, and one question that echoed through every shift. What if belief really is stronger than power? It didn't start with a puck drop. It started with a chill, not just in the air, but in the minds of men. A freeze between empires, Washington and Moscow, two superpowers locked in a stare-down that stretched from deserts to orbit, and all the way to the ice. The Cold War was at its bitter midpoint. The Vietnam War had left scars on American pride that hadn't yet healed, while the Soviet Union flexed its muscle across Eastern Europe with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Afghanistan had just been invaded. The U.S. had answered with grain embargoes and threats to boycott the Moscow Olympics. The world was splitting atom by atom, line by line. The cold was not just in the air. It seeped into minds, into policy, into the sinews of two nations locked in a decades-long stare-down. Washington and Moscow, two superpowers, two ideologies, two ways of life, each convinced the other was a threat to the world's future. In the late 1970s, their battle lines weren't drawn in trenches or deserts. They were drawn in pixels on radar screens, in the silence of nuclear submarines, in space, and on ice. The Cold War was at its bitter midpoint. The Vietnam War had left scars on American pride that hadn't yet healed, while the Soviet Union flexed its muscle across Eastern Europe with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Afghanistan had just been invaded. The U.S. had answered with grain embargoes and threats to boycott the Moscow Olympics. The world was splitting atom by atom, line by line. And in this frozen standoff, sport, specifically hockey, was more than just a game. It was narrative warfare. Each goal, each check, each slapshot became a political metaphor. The rink was a miniature battlefield where ideology wore skates and fought with sticks. The Soviet Union, masters of the ice, saw their dominance not just as athletic, but as proof that socialism worked, that their system bred harmony, efficiency, precision. Meanwhile, the Americans still clung to the romanticism of sport as meritocracy, where effort and individuality could triumph over structure. But in truth, the U.S. had little reason for optimism. By 1980, the Soviet Red Army team had become a nearly mythic force. 4 Olympic golds in a row, a record that sent shivers through every opposing locker room. Their plays were surgical, their movements choreographed like a Bolshoi ballet, and their endurance inhuman. To watch them was to watch a system operate through men. And it wasn't just their tactics, it was how they trained. The Soviets practiced like machines, 11 months a year, isolated from the world, built on discipline so brutal it broke bones and minds alike. In contrast, the American hockey team that would travel to Lake Placid consisted of college kids, amateurs in name, in experience, and in expectations. They were never supposed to win. They were supposed to try hard, maybe steal a game or two. But beating the Soviets? That was a fantasy best left to Hollywood. Yet there was something deeper bubbling beneath the surface in 1980. A kind of quiet desperation, especially on the American side. The nation was in a tailspin. Gas lines snaked around corners. Inflation ate paychecks alive. Hostages sat blindfolded in Tehran. The presidency of Jimmy Carter, once a symbol of post-Watergate renewal, was now synonymous with malaise. People didn't talk about greatness anymore. They just wanted something, anything to believe in. And sport, in times like that, becomes a vessel, a lightning rod for hope. International competition had always been an outlet for nationalism, but during the Cold War, it turned into a proving ground for systems of belief. The Olympics in particular carried the weight of geopolitics more than medals. Every country marched not just under its flag, but under its economic model. In that sense, the 1980 Winter Games were more than a spectacle. They were a test of worldviews. The Soviets understood that perfectly. Their investment in sport wasn't sentimental. It was strategic. The Red Army team didn't just represent the USSR. They were the USSR in motion. Synchronized, tireless, dominant. When they stepped onto the ice, it was with the confidence of a nation that knew it couldn't lose. Losing would not only mean defeat on the scoreboard, it would mean that communism had cracks. And so they didn't lose. Not to professionals, not to amateurs, not even to NHL All-Stars. The previous year, they had dismantled a team of the NHL's best players in a series that left broadcasters stunned. The difference in caliber was cosmic. Watching the Soviets win wasn't suspenseful, it was inevitable. For the Americans, that inevitability created something more than fear. It bred humility. But it also bred resentment. A country that once saw itself as the leader of the free world was now being humiliated in nearly every global arena. Economics, diplomacy, and now, sports. To be beaten was one thing. To be expected to lose, that was worse. And into this atmosphere stepped a coach with fire in his belly and frost on his words. Herb Brooks was no miracle worker, not yet. But he understood the moment better than anyone. He understood that hockey was no longer just about systems or speed. It was about symbolism. If you could get 20 American boys to believe, truly believe, that they could topple a Goliath, then maybe, just maybe, the country could believe in itself again. But that was still weeks away. In the winter of 1979, the ice was just starting to harden. The U.S. team hadn't been selected. The Soviet train was already at full speed. And the Olympic stage was being built plank by plank in the tiny mountain town of Lake Placid, New York, a place that would soon become the epicenter of the sporting world and the heart of something much bigger. Outwardly, nothing looked unusual. Snow fell. Schedules were printed. Tickets were sold. But inside locker rooms and behind podiums, you could feel the weight. You could see it in Soviet eyes, confident, steely. You could hear it in American voices, quiet, searching, not yet ready, but not yet willing to surrender. And somewhere, beneath the surface, history was cracking. The kind of crack that doesn't make a sound at first, just a tremor, just a shift. But later, it becomes a roar. And that roar was coming. They didn't skate like others. They floated, seamless, surgical, terrifying in their synchronicity. The Soviet Red Army hockey team had become less a sports squad and more a myth, an unstoppable force that blurred the line between athleticism and statecraft. Since the 1950s, they had redefined what hockey could be. Not just faster, smarter, tighter, devastating. By 1980, they were not merely undefeated in Olympic play. They were untouchable. Valery Kharlamov was a blur, a poet with a puck. Boris Mikhailov, the captain, embodied strength wrapped in cold fire. Vladimir Tretiak, between the pipes, was as impenetrable as the Iron Curtain itself. They weren't just players. They were instruments of ideology, tuned to perfection by a coach whose methods bordered on the fanatical. Viktor Tikhonov wasn't known for warmth. He was known for results. He trained his men like soldiers, sometimes more harshly. They lived in barracks for most of the year, separated from families, from distractions, from softness. Every pass, every shift change, every shot was rehearsed until the body could no longer rebel. If you missed a step, you sat. If you hesitated, you ran stairs. If you spoke out, you vanished. There was no margin for weakness, because weakness wasn't just personal, it was political. The Soviet leadership understood the symbolic weight of victory, and they wielded it like a hammer. Every gold medal became a headline. Every perfect game, a parade. The team's dominance was not simply celebrated, it was weaponized. In classrooms, newspapers, parliaments, the success of the Red Army team was used as evidence that socialism produced not just ideology, but excellence. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America looked fractured. The 1970s had left it worn and doubtful. The Watergate scandal had eviscerated trust in leadership. The economic downturn had drained wallets and morale. And the Iran hostage crisis had plunged the nation into a collective helplessness it hadn't felt since World War II. It wasn't just a slump, it was a rupture. The sense of American invincibility, once so deeply rooted, had faded. Even in sport, the U.S. was on the defensive. The 1972 Olympic basketball loss to the Soviets still burned in the national memory. American athletes had been accused of arrogance, of failing to evolve. And in hockey, an area where the U.S. had once flirted with greatness, the results were even bleaker. A mix of inconsistent programs, underfunded coaching, and the amateur-only rule had made the U.S. team a revolving door of promise and disappointment. College players were brave, hungry, but raw. And when placed next to the Soviet veterans, who had played together for over a decade and trained year-round, the disparity felt cosmic. It wasn't a fair fight, and everyone knew it. And yet, the Americans still signed up, still trained, still believed, at least on some level, that miracles weren't fiction, that somehow, somewhere, greatness could be summoned. In late 1979, Lake Placid was selected to host the Winter Olympics. A small town with old-world charm, buried in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. It had hosted the Games once before, in 1932, but this time was different. The stakes weren't just regional, they were global. Construction crews worked through snow and ice to complete the Olympic Village. Security was increased. The eyes of the world, weary from war and recession, turned once again toward the white stillness of sport. There was a fragile hope in that maybe, for 2 weeks, countries could compete with sticks instead of guns. That maybe under the Olympic torch, something pure still flickered. But purity was a myth in Cold War politics. The Soviets saw Lake Placid as another opportunity to extend their streak. Another chance to prove supremacy on a world stage. Their roster was set, their tactics refined, their confidence absolute. They had just humiliated a team of NHL stars in the 1979 Challenge Cup, winning 6-0 in a performance that felt less like a game and more like a lecture. Even Canada, the cradle of hockey itself, had bowed to Soviet dominance. The Americans, meanwhile, were scrambling. The selection process had begun. Herb Brooks, named head coach, was already a controversial pick. He was brilliant, yes, but uncompromising. He demanded systems where chaos reigned. He demanded speed, discipline, and above all, sacrifice. His goal wasn't just to build a team. It was to forge a unit of men who would bleed together, believe together, break together. In press rooms, nobody spoke the word gold. Not seriously. Most didn't even speak the word medal. The realists predicted a mid-tier finish. The optimists hoped for a few close games. The Soviets? They didn't predict. They expected. And that expectation became a kind of pressure. Not for them, but for everyone else. The Americans weren't just playing hockey. They were stepping into a political arena. Every shift was a subtle act of defiance. Every goal conceded, a surrender of face. Every success, a rebellion against the script. For the players, many of whom were still teenagers, this was a pressure they couldn't yet fathom. They weren't thinking about communism or capitalism. They were thinking about ice time, about systems, about impressing Brooks, about making the roster. But they would soon realize that their journey wasn't just about pucks and skates. It was about a nation's psyche. A nation that had been bruised, mocked, and doubted. A nation in search of a new story. As the snow fell heavier over Lake Placid and the lights flickered on inside the half-finished arena, that story waited. It had no name yet, no heroes, no miracle, just a date on the calendar, creeping closer. February 1980. Nobody knew that a collection of college boys, stitched together with grit and tension, would write one of the most unforgettable chapters in sports history. Nobody knew that the cold silence of the Cold War would be broken by a roar not from missiles, but from 10,000 stunned fans and a voice shouting, "Do you believe in miracles?" But before the miracle, before the thunder and glory, there had to be ice. And on that ice, a crack was already forming. Begin Block 3, The Soviet Machine, Part 1. They didn't wear numbers, they wore patterns. The Soviet Red Army team, in motion, looked less like athletes and more like a mechanism. Each movement a gear, each pass a piston. There was no chaos in their game, no improvisation, only execution, precision, flow. It was a hockey system, yes, but it was also a statement. A nation's pride built on the illusion of perfection. At the heart of that machine was Viktor Tikhonov, tall, angular, unreadable. He had the face of a man who hadn't smiled in decades, and a voice that could bend steel. Tikhonov was not merely a coach. He was a commandant, a tactician, a zealot. He didn't just lead the team, he controlled it. Training didn't take place on a rink. It took place in a closed compound outside Moscow, behind barbed wire and concrete silence. 11 months a year. No families, no distractions, no dissent. He believed in repetition. Not for muscle memory, but for obedience. A player didn't need to think. He needed to react. Faster, cleaner, better. Every drill, every scrimmage, every shift was part of a ritual that shaped men into instruments. If a player questioned him, he was benched. If he slacked, he vanished. In Tikhonov's eyes, individuality was cancer, and cancer had to be cut. The system he built was breathtakingly efficient. Gone were the Wild West instincts of North American hockey, dump and chase, brute force, goons with fists. The Soviets built their empire on geometry, triangles, weaves, tape-to-tape passes that defied angles and gravity. The puck moved faster than the eye could follow. And when it reached the blade of a waiting sniper like Kharlamov or Makarov, the net rippled like a flag in the wind. They didn't play for themselves. They played for a concept, for a nation, for an ideology that saw beauty in uniformity. From the moment they laced their skates, Soviet players were taught not to stand out. Goals were shared. Applause was muted. Celebration was discouraged. After all, joy was inefficient, a waste of energy. And in Tikhonov's world, every breath had purpose. The team's formation began early. Children identified at 8 or 9 were pulled from families and placed into state-run sports schools. There, they trained not only their bodies, but their obedience. They studied diagrams instead of dreams, and by the time they reached the Red Army system, they had already been broken and rebuilt a dozen times. Some called it brilliance, others brainwashing. But results spoke louder than ethics. In the 1970s, no team on Earth could touch the Soviets. They didn't just win, they dismantled. They didn't celebrate. They stared blankly at the scoreboard as if victory was a routine, not a thrill. Opposing coaches would spend weeks dissecting their formations, their line changes, their trap zones. But the Soviets always had another layer, another pattern, another move. And behind it all was Tikhonov, adjusting the dials. Yet even machines have weaknesses. They rust, they grind, they forget how to feel. Some of the Soviet players, deep inside, carried quiet rebellions. They laughed when no one watched, whispered complaints in safe corners, missed their families, resented the barracks. But none dared say it aloud. In that system, silence was safety. What made the Soviet machine terrifying was not just its skill, but its totality. It didn't end when the game did. These were men who lived in systems within systems. Their passports were held by handlers. Their interviews were scripted. Their dreams had borders. And yet, watching them play, it was hard not to be in awe. Their power plays were art. Their penalty kills, anticipation ballet. Even their warm-ups felt choreographed by mathematicians. And because they played together year-round, the chemistry was almost supernatural. They read each other's minds not by instinct, but by design. In North America, players were shuffled between teams, traded mid-season, or thrown onto Olympic rosters with weeks of preparation. The Soviets had played together for years. They didn't need plays. They were the play. When they faced off against international teams, they didn't adjust. They dictated. Coaches would throw every strategy in the book at them: aggression, traps, forechecks, but the Soviets would simply absorb and punish. If you pressed too hard, they danced around you. If you sat back, they crushed you. There was no right answer, only delay of the inevitable. And yet, for all their cold brilliance, the cracks were there. Tiny, invisible, but real. Not on the scoreboard, not in the stats, but in the soul. You could see it in the eyes of a tired defenseman during a meaningless third period, or in the slouch of a forward benched for a harmless mistake. Behind the flawless symmetry, there was fatigue, pressure, a quiet question no one dared ask aloud. What happens if we lose? For Tikhonov, that question was blasphemy. To lose meant weakness, and weakness in the world he'd built was treason. But Lake Placid was coming. And for the first time in years, the machine would face not just an opponent, but a mirror. A team built on chaos, on youth, on belief, not obedience. And machines, no matter how perfect, cannot feel belief. Behind the rigid symmetry of the Soviet system were men. Real men. With bodies that ached, lungs that burned, and minds that wandered late at night. They followed the machine's rhythm, but not always its purpose. Because even within the iron shell of collectivism, the human spirit never entirely dies. It hides. It waits. Some of them still dreamed. Vladimir Krutov would stare out the window of the dormitory compound and think about nothing in particular. Just the sound of wind on the walls, the faint hum of Moscow far beyond the fences. Sergei Starikov kept a small notebook hidden under his mattress, where he wrote poems. Not because he wanted to publish them, but because silence needed a place to go. Even Boris Mikhailov, the unshakable captain, sometimes hesitated before another week of drills, not out of doubt, but exhaustion. He had played for the motherland his entire adult life, but lately, he wondered what it might feel like to play for himself. They never said these things aloud. You didn't in that world, not even in whispers. There were ears everywhere. Even silence could be misinterpreted. Loyalty wasn't a choice. It was a condition. And yet, inside the perfectly timed line changes, the rehearsed celebrations, the ice-cold discipline, small fissures formed. The pressure never lifted. Expectations in the Soviet system didn't reward excellence. They punished its absence. A perfect game was just a return to zero. A single mistake could bring humiliation, not just from coaches, but from the press, the state, the invisible machinery that demanded perfection as proof of superiority. And what happens when perfection becomes a prison? They endured it because they had to, because they were proud. But pride in public can be different from pride in private. On the ice, they moved with robotic beauty. But behind closed doors, they argued over card games, joked about the food, griped about Tikhonov's latest rage. They laughed, quietly, cautiously. They were not machines. They were men pretending to be machines. And that pretension came at a cost. Kharlamov, once the soul of Soviet flair, had suffered through injury after injury. He played with screws in his knees, painkillers in his veins. He never complained, never asked out. But sometimes, teammates would see him sitting alone before a match, staring at his skates like they were anchors. He died just a year after Lake Placid. But even before the car crash, something inside him had been dimming. Tretiak, their legendary goaltender, had a presence as calm as winter glass. But calmness is not the absence of pressure. It's the refusal to show it. He had been on the Olympic stage before. He had won. Again and again. But in 1980, something felt different. Not about the opponents, but about the weight. Victory used to mean glory. Now it felt like obligation. The world saw them as giants, unbeatable, untouchable. But giants feel too. They feel fear. Not of failure on the scoreboard, but of what failure means when it's linked to your nation's pride, your family's reputation, your future. None of them had chosen this life. Not really. They had been selected, groomed, assigned. Their talent was never their own. It belonged to the state. They traveled the world, but couldn't roam. They met reporters, but couldn't speak freely. They were stars without freedom, heroes without autonomy, and they learned to live with it. There were moments, though, tiny flickers, when the facade would falter. A smirk after a forbidden deke, a glance to the stands, looking for a wife or a son they hadn't seen in weeks, a muttered curse when Tikhonov stormed past. These weren't acts of rebellion, but they were proof of life, proof that something human remained beneath the machinery. And yet, when the puck dropped, they became the system again. The line snapped into place. The flow began. It was hypnotic. They didn't just win games. They erased doubt. Spectators would forget their own allegiances, their politics, their teams. Watching the Soviets play was like watching inevitability, like gravity with blades. But gravity doesn't inspire. It impresses. It intimidates. It does not make hearts sing. The Soviet team rarely generated passion beyond their borders. Respect, yes. Fear, certainly. But love, not often. Because love needs vulnerability. And machines do not bleed. That would be the key difference in Lake Placid. Not skill, not training, but something softer. Something more dangerous to a system built on strength. Emotion. The Americans were messy, inexperienced, prone to mistakes. But they burned with something the Soviets hadn't felt in years. Hunger that wasn't assigned. Still, no one in the Red Army room felt threatened. Why would they? They had just dismantled the NHL's best players in front of millions. These Americans were college kids, green, nervous, barely teammates. The Soviets didn't just expect to win. They couldn't comprehend not winning. But belief, once it seeps in, doesn't care about logic. And somewhere deep inside that polished Soviet armor, in the quiet between matches, perhaps one or two of them began to feel a chill, not from the cold, but from something unknown. The realization that they were being watched, not just by fans or coaches, but by something larger. A moment, a turning point, a crack in the ice. And for the first time in a long time, the Soviet machine felt mortal. In America, hockey was never just a game, but it was never the game. It sat behind baseball's nostalgia, football's spectacle, and basketball's rise. It belonged to the cold states, the early risers, the kids who grew up sharpening their skates on backyard ponds and taped sticks in basements that smelled like old leather. It was a working-class sport in a country of shining stadiums, and that made it special. In places like Minnesota, Michigan, and Massachusetts, hockey was part of the landscape. Not glamorous, not televised, just there. A ritual of freezing mornings, duct-taped gloves, parents sipping coffee from thermoses on bleachers that never got warm. Boys became teammates before they became men. Rinks were louder than classrooms, and friendships were forged in penalty boxes and bus rides to nowhere. It wasn't a path to fame. There were no shoe deals, no million-dollar contracts waiting. If you played hockey in America in the 70s, you did it because it meant something. Because the cold made you feel alive. Because the sound of blades on fresh ice was cleaner than anything you heard on the news. And in that quiet loyalty lived the seeds of something unexpected. American hockey wasn't polished. It wasn't even respected on the world stage. College programs were isolated, scattered, and inconsistent. There was no national league feeding into Olympic greatness. There were no all-powerful state-run academies, just kids. College kids, good ones, scrappy ones, and a few great ones, but always underdogs, especially when compared to the machine across the sea. The United States had won hockey gold once, back in 1960. Squaw Valley. A miracle of its own, long forgotten outside of hockey circles. Since then, they drifted. A few decent showings, a few embarrassing exits. The NHL had its stars, yes, but Olympic play was amateur only. That rule suited the Soviets, whose amateurs were full-time professionals in disguise. For the US, it meant patching together a roster of students and dreamers every 4 years. And in 1980, that dream fell on a group of college boys barely old enough to vote. They weren't the best players in the country. Not all of them, anyway. They weren't even the most experienced. What they were was available, willing, hungry, and mostly unknown. Their names didn't echo through arenas. Their skates didn't leave trails of glory behind them. But they had something the system couldn't measure, something that pulsed beneath the doubt and the mockery. They had belief, not always loud, but steady. And into that quiet stepped a man who saw more than most. Herb Brooks didn't look like a revolutionary. He looked like a math teacher with a hockey stick. Soft-spoken, wiry, eyes that seemed to read 5 seconds into the future. But beneath the calm, he carried a fire that had scorched him more than once. He'd been the last man cut from the 1960 U.S. Olympic team. He knew the sting of almost, and he had spent his life sharpening that sting into vision. Brooks didn't want to build a team. He wanted to build a cause. He scouted players not just for skill, but for temperament, for hunger, for fuse length. He didn't care if they liked each other. He cared if they would die for each other. He believed that chemistry wasn't something you inherited. It was something you bled for. His methods weren't always kind, but they were clear. He selected players from rival programs, Minnesota, Boston University, Wisconsin, knowing full well the tension it would create. He forced them through brutal skates, endless drills, mind games. He questioned their identities, shouted when others would console, pushed when others would retreat. Because he wasn't just training hockey players. He was stripping away comfort, peeling off ego, building something harder, leaner, less polite. And the boys, though they didn't yet know it, needed that. They came from different coasts, different towns, different dreams. Some had grown up idolizing the NHL. Others had barely seen a professional game in person. But they all came with the same question beating quietly beneath their jerseys. Do I really belong here? Brooks never answered that for them. He let the ice answer. Every practice was a test. Every mistake, a lesson. Every shift, a moment to prove or fall. And slowly, under the pressure, something began to form. Not camaraderie, not yet, but grit, mutual understanding, a shared resistance to breaking. Mike Erusione wasn't the fastest skater. He wasn't the strongest. But he had a voice that carried, and a heart that never shut up. Buzz Schneider could shoot through walls. Neil Broughton saw passes before they existed. Jim Craig, quiet, thick-browed, full of contradiction, stood in goal like someone guarding the last candle in a storm. And there were others, too many to name, each one different, each one ordinary. And that ordinariness was the point. They weren't superstars. They weren't chosen by a nation. They were chosen by a coach. And they had chosen, against reason and odds, to step onto the world's coldest stage. In locker rooms around the world, professionals were being pampered. The Soviets had state chefs, team doctors, psychologists. The Americans? They had peanut butter, folding chairs, and bad towels. But they had something more valuable, too. Freedom. No one told them what to say. No one told them who to be. And when they laced up their skates, they weren't carrying the weight of perfection, just the hope of possibility. That hope was fragile, but it was growing. And far away in Lake Placid, the ice waited, flat, silent, empty for now, but not for long. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the pedigree, and they certainly didn't have the time. But what they did have was friction, raw, sharp, uncomfortable. And sometimes, that's where the fire starts. From the first day of camp, it was clear. This was not a band of brothers. This was a pack of rivals, forced together in the same rink, wearing the same jersey but carrying different flags in their hearts. Minnesota kids hated Boston kids. Boston kids hated Minnesota kids right back. Old grudges from college games bled into drills. Cheap shots in practice weren't accidents. They were reminders. This wasn't a team yet. It was a minefield. And Herb Brooks let it simmer. He didn't smooth things over. He didn't schedule icebreakers or team dinners. He turned the temperature up, pushed them through drills designed to frustrate, to expose weakness, yelled when they didn't pass to the guy they hated, benched them when they didn't hustle for a teammate they couldn't stand. Because Brooks knew something few others did. Unity forged in comfort was brittle. Unity forged in heat could withstand anything. But heat only goes so far when the equipment is secondhand and the locker room smells like mildew. The U.S. program was running on fumes. There were no lavish training centers, no private jets, no army of specialists, just tape, sweat, and hope. At one point, they had to beg for more sticks. Brooks knew the budget wasn't going to save them, so he made sure the attitude would. He told them the truth. You don't have the talent to win on talent alone. It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. If they were going to shock the world, they had to outwork it. That mindset trickled down, into the tape jobs, into the way they blocked shots in meaningless scrimmages, into the silence they learned to hold during Brooks' tirades. They began to measure themselves not against each other, but against the doubt that surrounded them. And the doubt was loud. The media didn't believe. The Federation didn't believe. Some of the players' own families didn't believe. They were seen as fodder, something for the Soviets to sharpen their blades on. The upcoming Winter Olympics in Lake Placid felt more like a formality than a stage. But inside that locker room, something quieter had started to form. Not confidence exactly. Not yet. But resistance. They weren't going to roll over. If they were going to lose, they'd make damn sure the other team had to earn every inch of ice. And then came the friendlies. They played the Canadian national team and got crushed. They played a few European squads with decent results, but it was sloppy. Undisciplined. Flashes of brilliance drowned in floods of mistakes. The kind of play that would be fatal against the Soviets. Brooks watched every second like a hawk, taking mental notes not on the goals, but on the responses. Who bounced back? Who sulked? Who yelled at a teammate? Who picked one up? He was still building, still cutting, still molding. Because Brooks wasn't just preparing them to win games, he was preparing them to carry something heavier, the American contradiction. This team, made of amateurs, represented a country obsessed with winners. A country that, deep down, didn't fully understand hockey. Not like Canada, not like the USSR. In many ways, the Americans were orphans in their own sport, playing for pride that had no parade route. But maybe that was the secret. They had no myth to live up to, no dynasty to defend. They had nothing except each other, and the belief that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. They started staying late after practice, shooting pucks long after the drills ended, arguing less, listening more. It wasn't kumbaya, it was work. Dirty, ugly, necessary work. Players began stepping into roles they hadn't asked for. Some became quiet leaders. Others became glue guys. Some, like Mike Erucione, became voices, louder than expected, harder to ignore. And behind it all, Brooks kept pressing. He didn't praise, not openly, but the drills changed. Less skating, more systems, less chaos, more identity. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were planning, thinking like a unit, playing like one, too. And still, no one cared. Headlines stayed small, crowds stayed thin. The NHL guys didn't watch. Most of the country didn't even know who was on the roster. But the players noticed something else. Something subtle. When they entered a new rink in a small town, the local kids stood a little taller. The rink managers offered stronger coffee. The Zamboni drivers nodded with a little more pride. Because they weren't just playing for a nation. They were becoming symbols of what that nation liked to believe about itself. That scrappy mattered. That hard work could outpace privilege. That belief still had a place in the world. They didn't talk about the Soviets. Not much. Not yet. It was too big, too distant, like staring at the sun. Instead, they talked about shifts, about breakouts, about which line combos clicked. They kept it close, manageable, because they knew the myth of invincibility begins to crumble not with courage, but with repetition. And somewhere in the back of their minds, they carried that image, the moment they'd be on the same ice as the greatest team ever assembled. No one expected them to win, but that meant no one could stop them from trying. He didn't look like much. Thin frame, thinning hair, slouched posture. He walked like a man used to ice, even on dry floors. Carefully, deliberately, as if the ground beneath him might shift without warning. Herb Brooks wasn't a figure you'd notice in a crowd. But once he opened his mouth, the air changed. He spoke in sharp bursts, words clipped, thoughts stacked like puzzle pieces. There was a rhythm to it, urgent, efficient, slightly chaotic, like a man thinking 10 seconds ahead and impatient with anyone who wasn't already there. Most of the players didn't know what to make of him at first. He wasn't warm. He didn't do introductions. He didn't ask how your mom was doing. What he did was watch. He watched the way you tied your skates, the way you looked when someone else scored, the way you breathed after a bad shift. To Brooks, the body told more truth than the mouth ever could. But before he became a coach, he was a ghost, a leftover. The last man cut from the 1960 Olympic team that won gold. A wound he never talked about, but never stopped feeling. It was more than a missed opportunity. It was a fracture in his identity, one that festered, hardened, and over time sharpened into vision. Brooks didn't believe in fate. He believed in preparation. He believed in discomfort. And he believed, to his bones, that greatness came not from talent, but from pain, repetition, and the refusal to be ordinary. At the University of Minnesota, where he built his reputation, he took a struggling program and turned it into a powerhouse. But he did it his way. He challenged authority. He drove players to the edge. He created systems no one else dared try. And when those systems worked, he didn't celebrate. He asked why they didn't work better. When he was offered the U.S. Olympic job in 1979, he didn't hesitate. But he also didn't smile, because he knew exactly what it would take. He knew they wouldn't just be facing the Soviets. They'd be facing history, apathy, mockery, the sheer physics of expectation. And he would be the lightning rod for it all. So he built a wall around himself, around the team, around the dream. He began with selection, not just the best players, but the right players. A phrase he would repeat until it became gospel. He didn't want stars. He wanted friction. He wanted players who'd been underestimated, benched, overlooked. Players with a chip in the soul, not just on the shoulder. Because when the moment came, and it would, he needed people who didn't panic. His training camp was less a camp and more a crucible. Skates that lasted hours past exhaustion. Drills that blurred the line between physical and psychological torment. Players collapsing from sprints only to be told to get up and go again. And the famous again drill, an endless, nameless punishment that broke bodies and rebuilt something else in its place. He pushed them until they hated him. And he wanted them to. Because unity forged in affection is soft. Unity forged in resistance is steel. Brooks didn't care if they liked him. He didn't even care if they understood him. He only cared that when the time came, they would become something more than players. They would become one. He studied the Soviets obsessively, not just their tactics, but their psychology, their rhythm, their arrogance. He knew he couldn't outmuscle them, couldn't out-experience them, but he believed he could outthink them. If he built a team fast enough, smart enough, unpredictable enough, he could disrupt the machine. And that's what the Americans would become. A disruption, an anomaly, a question the Soviets weren't ready to answer. But before that, Brooks had to break the habits of American hockey. No more dump and chase, no more reacting instead of dictating. He introduced systems with more motion, more reads, more possession. He demanded creativity within structure, a contradiction most coaches wouldn't touch. But Brooks wasn't most coaches. He was an architect of chaos, calculated chaos. And the players, they struggled. At first, it was like learning a new language under fire. Mistakes piled up, tempers flared, rivalries deepened. But through it all, Brooks remained cold, clinical, unrelenting. Because he didn't want them to rely on him. He wanted them to find something in each other. Behind closed doors, he wasn't emotionless. He carried a photograph of the 1960 team in his wallet. Looked at it sometimes before practice, not out of jealousy, but out of hunger. He wanted to build something that no one else believed in, because that's what had been taken from him. And slowly, his vision began to materialize. Not in wins, not in stats, but in glances, in shared nods after long drills, in the way a Boston kid passed to a Minnesota kid without flinching, in the silence after practice. Not bitter anymore, just tired and aligned. They weren't a team yet, but they were becoming one. And Brooks, for all his armor, all his distance, all his cruelty, he knew what he was building. Not just a group of players, but a brotherhood held together by something tougher than affection. Purpose. The first real gathering wasn't a celebration. It wasn't even a team meeting. It was a confrontation. Herb Brooks didn't shake hands. He handed out warnings. The kind that didn't come with a smile, just a stare and a stopwatch. From the moment those players stepped into that rink, they weren't boys with dreams anymore. They were unfinished pieces of a machine he hadn't built yet, and he didn't trust any of them. He made it clear, no one was safe. Not from cuts, not from criticism, not even from themselves. Most coaches start by building trust. Brooks started by breaking assumptions. The locker room, filled with NCAA champions and all-stars in their own right, was suddenly quiet. Not because they respected him yet, but because they didn't know what the hell he was about to do. The first practice wasn't technical. It was psychological warfare disguised as conditioning. They skated. Hard, in silence. Then again. Then again. The drills had no names, no endpoints. Just punishment with purpose. Legs failed, mouths dried. Still, he gave no praise, just commands. And eyes, those relentless narrow eyes, watching everything. He was looking for the cracks, not the kind that show up on stat sheets, the kind that appear when the lungs collapse and the mind starts negotiating. He watched who quit first, who cursed under their breath, who cheated a line, who tried to help a teammate off the ice. He filed it all away. Because Brooks wasn't building a team, he was filtering one. The players, many of them still teenagers, were shell-shocked. Used to encouragement, routines, predictability. Suddenly they were inside something that felt more like a psychological experiment than a hockey program. But he didn't flinch. Because Brooks understood something they didn't yet. Cohesion isn't born from agreement. It's born from resistance. And resistance was everywhere. The old college rivalries didn't disappear. They hardened. The Minnesota guys still looked down on the East Coasters. The Boston players rolled their eyes at the farm boys. The drills became petty battles. Elbows flew. Fights broke out in practice. Brooks never stopped them, never punished them. Sometimes, he let them simmer a little longer, just to see who would step up and who would step away. He needed leaders, not volunteers. Jack O'Callahan, mouthy and fierce, pushed every boundary. Mark Johnson, quiet and consistent, won every battle without saying a word. Neil Broughton floated between the lines, part magician, part ghost. And then there was Jim Craig, the goaltender Brooks wasn't sure he could trust, staring down shots like they owed him money. But even as personalities emerged, egos resisted. Some players thought they'd already made the team. Others assumed they were just there to fill space. Brooks stripped them of those assumptions. Publicly. Coldly. He benched starters in scrimmages. He split up best friends on lines. He called out laziness in front of the entire group. And when one player questioned his tactics, Brooks cut him the next day. No explanation. No discussion. Lesson learned. This was not a democracy. Still, beneath the frostbite, something began to shift. They started showing up early. Not to impress him, but to avoid the humiliation of being late. They taped their sticks tighter, skated with sharper turns, listened more carefully during drills. Not because they liked him, but because they began to sense that this man, this hard, unrelenting figure in the shadows, was the only one who believed they could actually do the impossible. And that mattered. Because no one else did. In media circles, the American team was an afterthought. The Soviets were winning gold. That was written. The rest was window dressing. The Canadians had a chance. The Swedes were solid. The U.S. irrelevant. But Brooks saw something different. He saw potential not in skills, but in moments. He believed that if he could push these players beyond their own identities, beyond the schools on their jackets, the medals in their drawers, the doubts in their bones, he could make them dangerous, unpredictable, unified not by love, but by shared trauma. And in some strange way, the players began to understand. There was no big speech, no line in the sand, just a series of moments, a glance in a hallway, a passed puck during a drill, a muttered good shift between enemies. It was happening, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Even the fights changed. They didn't come from hate anymore. They came from fire, from frustration with mistakes, not backgrounds. And when they dropped the gloves, they picked each other up after. Not because Brooks asked them to, but because they realized, maybe for the first time, that no one else was going to. Not their schools, not their families, not the press, just each other. Brooks saw it before they did. He started easing up, barely, letting them breathe between drills, dropping a comment here and there that almost sounded like belief. He wouldn't call it praise, but it was something. And for a group that had been starving for weeks, it felt like a feast. The turning point came not in a game, but in an empty rink. They were practicing late, long past the scheduled time. The arena lights were dim, the ice scarred. Players were exhausted, drained to the bone. And yet, when Brooks finally blew the whistle, told them they could leave, no one moved. They stayed, skated a little longer, passed the puck, laughed, just once or twice, and something hung in the air that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not rebellion, not even trust. It was ownership. This was becoming their team, not his, not the Federation's, theirs. Built through pain, yes, but claimed through choice. Brooks didn't smile. He simply nodded, then turned away, because it was working. At first, they were just shapes in matching sweaters, men with the same patches stitched across their chests, but with different fire stitched into their veins. Some looked left when the puck dropped. Others looked right. One skated like a dancer, another like a brawler. Even their laughs came in different rhythms. And yet, they kept showing up. The rink in Lake Placid became their crucible. Cold, sharp, and echoing with unfinished stories. Brooks kept his distance, always. He didn't speak of bonding, didn't preach togetherness. But he engineered the conditions where it might emerge, if only by accident. The early mornings were the worst. Skates laced with sleep still in their eyes. Tempers brittle. Knees sore. The ice unforgiving. Brooks wouldn't speak at first. He'd just blow the whistle. And they'd go. One drill, then another, then again. He didn't care about elegance. He watched for survival. And slowly, grudgingly, something began to shift. Not in the games, not even in the locker room, but in the spaces between. The hallways, the bus rides, the quiet between drills. Players who once snarled at each other started sharing sticks, taping shoulders, passing water bottles. No speeches, no breakthroughs, just an unspoken truce, carved out of mutual exhaustion. The walls started to drop. Jack O'Callahan, once the loudest mouth in the room, was now yelling for others to get back on defense. Mark Pavelich, the quiet loner, began passing first, thinking less like a sniper and more like a puzzle piece. Mike Ramsey, the young defenseman with a hammer for a stick, started skating not for himself, but to cover a gap left by a teammate. They were becoming a team, not out of love, out of necessity. It was during one of the scrimmages late in camp that it became undeniable. There was a loose puck. Two players dove for it, one from Boston, one from Minnesota. The collision was hard, careless. Tempers flared, elbows rose. But this time, something different happened. The bench didn't shout. No one fought. Instead, someone reached out, pulled the other up. No drama, no applause. Just a quiet, tired gesture that said, "We don't have time for this anymore." Brooks saw it. He didn't smile, but he skipped the next conditioning set. That was his version of a thank you. They started sitting together during meals, not by state, but by position. The lines on the ice started echoing in the dining hall. Centers with wingers, defensemen paired up. The jokes got louder. The silences got shorter. Still, it wasn't perfect. There were flare-ups, slips, rivalries that refused to fully die. The Boston boys still thought they skated smarter. The Minnesota kids still believed they played purer. But now the fights ended faster. The grudges faded quicker. Because for the first time, the fear of losing had grown stronger than the instinct to divide. And in the middle of it all was Brooks. Cold, calculating, deliberate. He kept mixing the lines, kept benching veterans, kept throwing rookies into pressure drills just to see who would crack. He wanted the unity to form without him. If they were going to fight for each other in February, it had to come from them. He kept pushing. He made them memorize systems in their sleep. He grilled them during film sessions until their confidence burned down to embers. He drove them past strategy and into instinct, so that when the moment came, they wouldn't think. They'd move. And slowly, they began to feel it. They weren't outskating the Soviets, not yet. But they were outlasting each other, staying on the ice longer, holding formations tighter, screaming each other's names with urgency instead of spite. Even the trainers noticed. More high fives, less limping to the bench, the tap of sticks on shin guards after good shifts, rituals forming in silence. Not traditions handed down, but born, minute by brutal minute, in that freezing rink. The brotherhood wasn't built in one speech or one game. It came in the weight of repetition, in shared fatigue, in knowing, without needing to say it, that the guy next to you might be your only lifeline in what was coming. And what was coming was enormous. It always simmered just beneath the surface. Minnesota versus Boston. It wasn't spoken aloud most of the time, but it didn't need to be. The glances gave it away. The grudges from past college matchups still tingled in their blood. The way they held their sticks, the way they didn't pass, the way they'd check a little harder in scrimmages if the number across the ice was too familiar. Jack O'Callahan was Boston to the bone. Swagger, snarl, and a mouth that could cut glass. He had the instincts of a street kid and the spine of a lion. And he carried a chip not on his shoulder, but in his heart. One that had grown from years of being overlooked, second-guessed, underappreciated. He didn't just play hockey. He played to prove something. The Minnesota guys saw him as reckless, too emotional, too loud. They preferred control, structure, passes that felt like equations. Neil Broughton skated like a surgeon. Buzz Schneider had the calm of a veteran. And Bill Baker played defense like he was solving a riddle no one else could see. O'Callahan didn't care for riddles. He liked collisions. And at first, it nearly tore the team apart. There was one scrimmage in particular, brutal, fast, chippy. O'Callahan took a run at Broughton, laid him out hard. No penalty, no apology, just a stare, daring someone to answer back. Someone did. Rob McClanahan, another Minnesota forward, dropped his gloves without hesitation. They went at it. No crowd, no referees, just pride and memory and the echo of college colors now hidden under red, white, and blue. Brooks didn't stop it. He let it burn. Afterwards, no lecture. Just a new line assignment the next day. O'Callahan, McClanahan, and Broughton. Same shift. It was cruel. It was deliberate. It was Herb Brooks at his most manipulative and most brilliant. The first few shifts were ugly. Missed passes, silent changes, glares between whistles. But then, something changed. In a tight scrimmage down a goal, McClanahan made a risky pass. No look, dangerous. He could have been burned for it, but O'Callahan caught it, scored, didn't celebrate, just skated back to the bench and tapped McClanahan's shin. Nothing needed to be said. That's how it began. Not with forgiveness, but with usefulness. They started seeing each other not as threats, but as assets. As people who would dive in front of a slapshot for them. As people who had suffered the same drills, the same cold mornings, the same cutting remarks from Brooks. Shared pain is its own kind of glue. And no one embodied that more than Jack O'Callahan. Because when he went down with a knee injury just days before the Olympics, it wasn't silence that followed. It was panic. He had become, against all odds, a pulse in the locker room. The guy who picked up tempo with a hit, who snapped a joke in the middle of hell, who turned fights into fire. His absence echoed, not just on the ice, but in the breath between drills, in the tone of the room. Craig Patrick, the assistant coach, quietly asked Brooks if they should replace him. Brooks shook his head. "We're not replacing Jack," he said. "We're waiting for him." It was the clearest vote of belief the team had ever heard from him, and it wasn't lost on them. While O'Callahan rehabbed, the team kept skating. But something in them had shifted. They weren't skating for themselves anymore. They were skating for someone missing, someone who had earned their trust the hard way. Then there was the night in the dorms. They weren't supposed to be drinking, but someone had smuggled in a six-pack, maybe two. No coaches, no film session. Just a room of young men, tired and aching and slowly realizing that they were all they had. They told stories, old ones, embellished, exaggerated. Some of them repeated, but no one cared. It wasn't about the punchline. It was about the rhythm of belonging. The way laughter sounded different when you knew it wouldn't be held against you. They even started mocking Brooks, his drills, his whistle, the way he said, "Legs feed the wolf." It became a refrain, half joke, half prayer. Legs feed the wolf. Legs feed the wolf. And in that moment, as stupid as it was, they became something real. Not just players, brothers. It wasn't clean. It wasn't cinematic. There were still clashes, still silences, still doubts. But beneath all that, the core had solidified. Even the rivalries faded, not because they forgot, but because they'd seen what mattered more. Who passed in pressure? Who hustled on the backcheck? Who covered for a mistake without calling it out? And in the center of it all, wounded, limping, but louder than ever, Jack O'Callahan returned. He wouldn't be 100%. Everyone knew it. But no one said a word. Because in a team where almost nothing was ever promised, the only thing that mattered was that when the puck dropped, they were together. All of them. The first puck drop wasn't magical. It was a slap in the face. After months of skating in the cold, bleeding through drills, and learning each other's breathing patterns, the U.S. team finally stepped onto the ice against real opponents. But what greeted them wasn't inspiration. It was exposure. They weren't ready. Not for the pace. Not for the precision. Not for the sudden weight of playing under the lights, where every misstep echoed louder than a goal horn. The European clubs they faced in the exhibition games moved like ghosts, silent, efficient, clinical. The Americans chased them, tripping over systems they thought they had mastered, second-guessing passes they'd made 1,000 times in practice. Losses came quickly: Sweden, Czechoslovakia, a brutal shutout by the Soviets in one early friendly. No matter the opponent, the outcome felt the same. They were too slow, too loose, too American. And suddenly, the noise from the outside world grew sharper. What had been dismissed as a curiosity now became a target. Journalists used words like outclassed and embarrassed. European coaches muttered things like, "not even competitive." And some U.S. sports writers, with grim certainty, suggested the Olympic Committee had made a mistake by even sending a team of amateurs to Lake Placid. Brooks read it all. Every headline, every snide remark. And he said nothing. To the players, at least. On the bench, he stayed silent. No outbursts, no corrections. He let them fumble. Let them taste what it felt like to believe you were becoming a team, and then get torn apart in public. Because it was part of the plan. You don't harden steel in lukewarm water. Still, the players weren't in on the plan. Not fully. They were confused, frustrated. Some began to doubt what they were doing. They had trained so hard, followed so blindly, and still, they looked like a junior varsity team against even the mid-tier European squads. In one game against West Germany, Jim Craig let in 5 goals on 16 shots. It wasn't all his fault. The defense left him exposed. The forwards turned the puck over like they were gift wrapping it. But the numbers didn't care. And Craig, once so certain of his place, sat in the locker room with his head down, wondering if maybe the whispers were right. Maybe they weren't enough. There was one night in Oslo after a sloppy loss. The team sat in silence on the bus. No music, no jokes, just cold air and heavier shoulders. Mike Erusione finally muttered something. "Feels like we're just wasting time." Nobody answered. They didn't have to. The silence was agreement. And that's when Brooks acted. Not with words, not with comfort, but with fire. The next practice was scheduled for 9 a.m., but at 6:30, the players were woken by pounding on their doors. They thought it was a mistake, a prank, until they saw Brooks in the hallway, fully dressed, clipboard in hand, eyes like coals. They skated for hours, no drills, no pucks, just sprints, lines, stops and starts, again, again, again. No music in the rink, no encouragement, just the whistle and the echo of blades tearing across the ice. Again, they collapsed. Again, they puked. Again, and still he pushed. Players fell to their knees. Some begged under their breath. Some cursed. But Brooks didn't hear them. Or maybe he did. It didn't matter. Again. It became a chant, a curse, a prayer. The rink manager eventually turned off the lights, thinking practice was over. Brooks didn't care. In the dark, they skated. Shadows moving across glass, stripped of dignity, stripped of pretense, stripped of everything but breath and defiance. And then, finally, it happened. Brooks shouted a question, not to anyone, but to everyone. "Who do you play for?" Silence. Then, from somewhere deep, a voice cracked through. "United States of America." Brooks stopped. He nodded once, then walked off the ice. No speech, no explanation. But the message was burned into their legs, into their lungs, into their pride. You don't wear a college logo anymore. You don't fight for Minnesota or Boston. You play for something bigger, and you either die on that ice for it, or you get the hell off the team. From that night on, things changed. Slowly, but definitely. They stopped skating as individuals. They started covering for each other, blocking shots that weren't theirs to block, chasing rebounds that weren't theirs to chase. Because suddenly, this wasn't about proving something. It was about surviving something. Together. They would remember that night in Norway for the rest of their lives, not because of what happened in the game, but because of what followed. After a 3-3 tie with a sluggish Norwegian team, Herb Brooks didn't go back to the locker room. He went to the edge of the rink, pointed to the line markings, and said only one word. Again. The players thought it was a drill, maybe a short cool-down. It wasn't. They started skating, end to end, blue line to blue line, again, and again. At first it was familiar, something they'd done 100 times before. But then, something shifted. Brooks didn't stop them. The drills didn't change. No pucks, no water. Just lungs tightening, legs failing, and a coach with no expression. Again. The rink emptied of spectators. The janitors stared. The lights dimmed, but the whistles kept coming. Again. Mike Erusione fell to one knee. Jim Craig dry-heaved in the corner. Dave Silk tried to skate through a cramp in his back that felt like a knife twisting. Still, again. It wasn't punishment. It was exorcism. Brooks didn't shout. His voice remained calm. Monotonous, mechanical. A human metronome counting out their suffering in single-word increments. Every repetition scraped away ego. Every whistle pounded against the cracks in their identity. They began to hate him. And then, they began to understand him. Because he wasn't just making them stronger. He was breaking something in them that had to die. The college pride, the excuses, the softness of men who had never been asked to bleed together, only next to each other. Somewhere between the 50th sprint and the 60th, the air in the arena changed. The complaints stopped. The glances between players hardened into nods. A silent pact formed on that ice, forged not in trust but in torment. And then, it happened. Brooks barked the same question he'd asked in camp. "Who do you play for?" The silence was different now. Not confusion, not defiance, just waiting. Then, clear and raw from the middle of the line, came the answer. "United States of America." Brooks froze. A beat. Then he blew the final whistle. Practice was over. It wasn't a teaching moment. It was a rebirth. From that day on, something elemental had changed. They weren't a collection of college stars anymore. They were a singular force, still raw, still flawed, but now bound by something more than drills and systems. They had suffered together. And that kind of pain makes loyalty permanent. The next practices ran smoother, still brutal, still silent. But now the drills clicked into place. The breakout passes found sticks. The forecheck became instinct. When one man turned, the others adjusted without thinking. It looked like choreography. And Herb Brooks? He smiled. Not in front of them. Never in front of them. But in private, he told Craig Patrick, "They're almost there. They don't even know it yet." Brooks didn't believe in pep talks. He believed in resistance. His praise came in subtleties. One less repetition, a slight nod, a moment's silence instead of critique. And the players, desperate for even the faintest approval, soaked it in like sunlight after a storm. Even the media began to notice. Reporters who once mocked the team's chaotic losses now saw something steely in their stride. The turnovers decreased. The shot totals rose. Jim Craig began making saves that didn't look possible. Not flashy, just right. Like he was finally seeing the game a second faster than everyone else. The team still lost a few more exhibition games. But now they lost with teeth, with structure, with identity. And behind the scenes, Brooks continued shaping them. He shortened rest days, scrapped game plans mid-practice to test adaptability, pulled players mid-shift just to see how the others reacted. Every moment was a lab experiment in chemistry and collapse. They started policing themselves. If someone slacked in a drill, it wasn't Brooks who said something. It was Dave Christian, or Mark Johnson, or O'Callahan, now skating on a taped-up knee with the fury of someone who'd rather die than sit. The team had stopped fearing failure. They started fearing each other's disappointment. One night, late in January, they stayed in the rink after lights out. No coaches, no drills, just an impromptu skate in silence. Some took shots, others just glided, letting the cold air bite their cheeks. It wasn't a practice. It wasn't a ritual. It was a moment of stillness before the storm. Lake Placid was near. The Olympics were becoming real. But on that ice, alone in the quiet, they weren't thinking about medals or matchups. They were thinking about the man next to them, the bruises they'd hidden, the curses they'd swallowed, the miles they'd skated, and how far they'd come from that rink in Norway. From again. It wasn't the Olympics. Not yet. But it felt like it. The U.S. team rolled into New York City in early February, and everything suddenly got louder. The streets, the media, the expectations. After months of silence, sweat, and near anonymity, they now stood under the bright lights of Madison Square Garden, America's most iconic arena. This was their final test before Lake Placid. And their opponent wasn't just anyone. It was the Soviet Union. The real deal. Not a scrimmage, not a B team. The same juggernaut that would meet them again in the Olympic round. Herb Brooks didn't smile. He didn't preach victory. He just said what needed to be said. Let's see how far we've come. And then he let them go. Outside, the city buzzed with a strange energy. A few sports writers still treated the game like a formality, a tune-up for the Soviets. But others had started whispering things, dangerous things, about the Americans. Words like momentum, chemistry, and spark. No one predicted a win, but they wanted to believe that something was building. That maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be a disaster after all. Then the puck dropped, and belief got slaughtered. The Soviets didn't play like a team warming up. They played like they always did. Merciless, fluid, terrifying. It was art and war in equal measure. Every pass was tape to tape. Every rush was a symphony. The Americans weren't just outplayed, they were humiliated. 10-3, that was the final score, and it felt merciful. Vladislav Tretiak barely broke a sweat. Boris Mikhailov scored with such ease it looked scripted. And when Krutov deked past two defensemen and slipped the puck between Craig's legs, the crowd gasped. Not because of the goal, but because of how easy it looked. It wasn't a game. It was a message. In the locker room afterward, no one said a word. Some players sat in full gear for 20 minutes just staring at the floor. Craig looked shell-shocked. Mark Johnson threw his gloves into the wall and then immediately regretted it. Not because of the anger, but because of how useless it felt. Brooks didn't scream. He didn't skate out the rage like he had in Norway. Instead, he did something worse. He sat, and he watched them. Every face, every bruise, every doubt. "You still think you can beat them?" he finally asked. No one answered. "Good," he muttered, "because now we're done thinking." That night, he pulled Craig aside. "You're still my guy," he said, "but I need you to be bigger than you've ever been." Craig nodded. But inside, something was cracking. Not from fear, but from knowing what it would take, what it would cost. The next morning, practice was quiet, focused, not from confidence, but from necessity. There was no more illusion, no more hype, just reality. And reality had red jerseys, ruthless passes, and no mercy. Mike Erucione rallied the guys in the locker room. "Forget the score. Did you see the way they moved? That's what we've got to match. Not beat, match." He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He just said it like it was a fact. Like a challenge. Like a dare. Because they knew now what they were facing. The world hadn't just underestimated the Soviets. They had misunderstood them. This wasn't David and Goliath. This was a slingshot against a freight train. Still, something strange happened over the next few days. The mood didn't collapse. It calcified. They didn't laugh much. They didn't argue. They just trained, harder, sharper, angrier. Brooks changed nothing. He didn't panic, didn't tweak the lines. He just tightened the screws a little more. Shorter shifts, more urgency, less margin for error. And then came the media. Cameras, microphones, headlines. Suddenly, the kids from Minnesota and Boston were on national TV. People wanted to know who they were, where they came from, why they still believed. And to a man, they answered the same way. "We're not there yet, but we will be." It wasn't arrogance. It was survival. They were boarding the train to Lake Placid, and the ticket didn't come with a guarantee. But it did come with purpose. A common wound. A fire that had been forged in practice after practice, loss after loss, sprint after sprint. And now they were within reach of something unthinkable. A chance to write history, not as individuals, but as a brotherhood. They knew the Soviets could humiliate them again, but this time, they would know it was coming. And that made all the difference. They arrived in Lake Placid under snowfall. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. Just a quiet cold, seeping through their jackets as they stepped off the bus and looked around at the Olympic Village. The place felt more like a remote ski lodge than a global stage. No flashing lights, no roars. Just pine trees, fog, and the sense of something about to begin. But beneath the stillness, tension vibrated. For most of the players, it didn't feel real yet. This was the Olympics, and yet it didn't look like the Olympics they'd imagined. There were no grand stadiums or colossal banners waving in the wind. Just low barrack-style dorms, white paths carved through the snow, and a distant murmur of languages they didn't recognize. Herb Brooks gave them little time to reflect. "You've got one day," he said. "After that, it's all business." And he meant it. The first night, some of the guys wandered through the village, meeting athletes from Europe, from Asia, from countries they'd never heard of. They traded pins, posed for Polaroids, cracked nervous jokes. It was their last breath of normal. Then the curtain fell. Practice resumed the next morning, but sharper now, as if the cold itself had hardened their reflexes. Brooks cut through the air with clipped commands. He didn't talk about the Soviets. He didn't talk about miracles. He talked about angles, about stamina, about mental fatigue and sharp skates, and what happens in the final 5 minutes of the third period when every muscle is screaming. The Olympic locker room wasn't glamorous. It was small, gray, almost sterile. But the walls felt tighter now. The sound of tape tearing, skates grinding, pads thumping. It all had weight. These weren't tryouts anymore. Every breath they took from here on would echo through history. And outside the village, the country began to stir. Sports centers showed their faces. Newspapers began printing features. "The boys of winter," one columnist wrote. "Can they make America believe again?" The photos were grainy, but the message was clear. Something was happening in Lake Placid. Not a movement. Not yet. But a flicker. Jim Craig called home the night before the opening ceremony. His father answered, choked up before he could speak. "Just play your game, kid," he said. "We're watching." Erucione was interviewed by a Boston radio station. He kept it light, cracking wise about missing pizza and his mom's meatballs. But underneath it, he felt the pressure building. This wasn't college anymore. This wasn't obscurity. They were no longer anonymous. They were America's last best hope in a year that had offered very little else. The economy was flatlining. Hostages were still being held in Iran. The mood across the nation was brittle, like old glass ready to shatter. And now here came a bunch of scrappy nobodies, skating with borrowed courage and makeshift confidence, about to face the most dominant force in sports history. The team didn't talk much about politics, but they felt it. It hung in the locker room, in the reporters' questions, in the way people stared a second longer than usual, in the military presence near the Olympic complex. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was an idea of hope, of pride, of defiance. Opening ceremony night brought it home. They marched into the stadium in matching blue coats, holding the stars and stripes. The crowd roared. For a second, it all fell away. The pressure, the doubt, the bruises. They were kids again. Just kids, walking into a dream. Mark Johnson whispered, "We're really here." And they were. But Brooks didn't let them drift too long. As fireworks cracked above them, he reminded them what they were walking into. "This is theater," he said. "The real stuff starts tomorrow." He wasn't wrong. The schedule was merciless. The Swedes first, then the Czechs, then chaos. And somewhere beyond that, maybe, if they survived, the Soviets again. Nobody talked about revenge, but everyone remembered Madison Square Garden. The staff at the Olympic Village noticed a change in the Americans. They were quieter than the other teams, more focused. The Swedes joked and drank beer in the common areas. The Finns played cards and told stories. The Americans trained, studied, stayed in small groups. It wasn't superstition, it was survival. They couldn't afford to be ordinary, because they knew what was coming. Craig polished his mask every night, not out of vanity, but ritual. Erucione visualized the ice before he slept. Every line, every shift. O'Callahan stretched the scar tissue on his knee until it burned. They each found their own way to carry the weight. And Brooks? He watched them, not always directly. Sometimes from a hallway, sometimes through the glass, but always watching, calculating, adjusting, making sure the heat never dropped. That belief didn't become comfort. That hunger didn't turn to fear. Because fear was coming, in the shape of Slava Fedosov, of Tretiak, of Soviet Red. But first, they had to survive each other. Their own nerves, their own ghosts, their own expectations. The countdown had ended. The storm was here. The puck dropped on a Thursday afternoon, February 14th, 1980. Valentine's Day. But there was no love in the air, only nerves and noise. The Americans opened against Sweden, a team as crisp and efficient as any in the tournament. Not Soviet-level cold steel, but close. The Swedes played with precision, with rhythm, with an air of effortless control. And early on, it looked like they would skate right through Team USA. First period, Sweden struck. A quick cross-slot pass, and it was 1-0. Second period, they made it 2-1. The Americans kept chasing, clawing, never quite catching. Then came the third, and something began to turn. Mark Johnson found space where there shouldn't have been any. Buzz Schneider crashed the net like a freight train. And Jim Craig, steady now, confident, turned away every puck like it was personal. Still, the clock ticked down. Sweden led 2-1. Then, with just 27 seconds left, Brooks made a move. He pulled Craig. 6 attackers. Empty net. Sweden tightened. The crowd screamed. Johnson circled behind the net, cut hard right, and flicked a rebound past the goalie. 2-2. Explosion, not just in the stands, on the bench, in the locker room, in their chests. It wasn't a win, but it felt like one. Brooks didn't smile, but even he couldn't hide the twitch at the corner of his mouth. That tie, against that opponent, under that pressure, was more valuable than gold. They had survived their first real test. Next came Czechoslovakia. This wasn't a team to tie with. They were expected to destroy the Americans, a former powerhouse ranked just behind the Soviets. Heavy, fast, unforgiving. But something had shifted. Team USA skated out different that night. Shoulders higher, legs looser. Still nervous, but now dangerous. They didn't just play. They attacked. Erusione stole a puck on the forecheck, slid it across to Johnson. Goal. O'Callahan, knee still taped, leveled a Czech winger with a hit that sent the boards rattling. Craig shut down a 2-on-1 with a flash of the glove that left even the Czech bench clapping. Final score, 7-3. Stunning. The press room exploded. "David just found his sling," read one headline. Another simply said, "Believe." And just like that, the buzz turned to thunder. The team moved into rhythm. They started waking up with smiles. The weight wasn't gone, but it was shifting. No longer fear, but anticipation. Norway came next. Not an easy game, but a manageable one. The Americans didn't dominate, but they controlled. Craig was solid. Erusione buried a power play goal. They won 5-1. Momentum. Actual, visible momentum. And suddenly, the standings looked surreal. Team USA sat near the top. The Soviets, as expected, were crushing everyone in sight. No surprise. But the Americans? They weren't just hanging in. They were moving. Romania fell next. Not a threat, but still a hurdle. One they cleared with a 7-2 win. And then West Germany. A trap game if there ever was one. A European squad known for physicality, for grinding down flashy teams and dragging them into the mud. But not this time. The Americans punched first, and they never looked back. Craig turned away 25 shots. Eruzione and McClanahan each scored. The bench stayed tight, focused. Win, 4-2. 5 games played, 4 wins, 1 tie, undefeated, and the whispers turned into full-blown noise. Reporters who'd mocked Brooks were now praising his genius. Pundits debated whether this was the greatest underdog run in Olympic history, and the semifinals hadn't even begun. America was waking up early to watch. Bars played the games on silent screens, with crowds shouting at the glass. Families huddled around radios. Kids taped USA logos to their bedroom doors. And in Lake Placid, the team stayed quiet. Not because they didn't feel it, but because they couldn't afford to feel too much. Euphoria, after all, could kill momentum. Herb Brooks kept the practices short, kept the message clear. "Eyes forward," he said. "No medals yet." Still, the players began to sense it. Not just that they were winning, but that something bigger was forming. They weren't playing perfect hockey, but they were playing together. Like a machine, not the Soviet machine, but something more human. More erratic, but also more alive. Every time they touched the ice, they got stronger. Every shift, more connected. Every mistake, followed by accountability. Not from the coach, but from each other. There was no longer a Minnesota side, no Boston faction. There was just red, white, and blue. And beneath it all, one heartbeat. As the medal round approached, they felt it coming. Not just pressure, possibility. The kind of possibility that only shows up when everyone else thinks it's impossible. They hadn't beaten the Soviets yet, but they had earned the right to try. There was something unexplainable in the air now. A shift, not just in results, but in identity. Team USA, once stitched together from regional grudges and personal doubts, was becoming something else. A unit, a name, a myth in motion. And 2 faces began to rise above the rest, not because they wanted to, but because the story needed them. Jim Craig and Mike Eruzione. Craig had become more than a goalie. He was a wall, a ghost, a whisper that haunted every shot taken against him. He didn't shout, didn't boast, but he held. He absorbed everything, rubber, pressure, panic, and made it look quiet. His crease became sacred ground. Opponents skated in with fire in their eyes and left shaking their heads. And still, no one knew what he was carrying. After every game, Craig went straight to his room. He called home more than the others, sometimes just to listen, to hear his dad's breath, or the clink of forks against plates, or his sister's laugh in the background. He needed those sounds. Needed to remember that he wasn't just a player in a story. He was a son, a brother, a boy who once learned to skate on a frozen driveway in Northeaston. That grounding kept him still, kept him sharp. The team noticed. When Craig got quiet, they locked in. When Craig nodded, they believed. Even Herb Brooks, a man allergic to sentiment, gave him space. Let him be that center of gravity. Because he knew, if the miracle ever came, it would have to pass through Jim Craig first. Then there was Eruzione. Captain by voice, not by title. Mike wasn't the fastest, wasn't the strongest, but he was loud in all the right ways. He filled silences with fire, tension with humor. He named the hope everyone else was afraid to speak. After every goal, his eyes scanned the bench, not to celebrate, but to pull everyone back in, remind them what it meant. He wasn't scoring hat tricks, but he was scoring when it counted. And behind the mask of his confidence lived a deep, unshakable fear that it could all fall apart. That one mistake, one slip, would bring the dream crashing down. He carried that fear not with shame, but as a torch. He needed it, because without that edge, he knew they might relax. And if they relaxed, they'd die. He and Craig were opposites. Stillness and spark, steel and flame, and they needed both. As the group stage closed, The energy around the team became electric. Crowds lined up outside the Olympic rink hours before games. Journalists from Tokyo, Paris, Rio, all asking the same question. How is this possible? The players didn't know how to answer, because they didn't feel invincible. They felt together. That was the difference. They weren't winning because of talent. They were winning because they refused to break apart. And as belief grew around them, something even more dangerous grew inside them: expectation. Herb Brooks saw it coming. He felt it in the loosened shoulders, in the slight swagger as they entered the rink. So he brought them back. After the Germany win, he canceled media access. No interviews, no cameras, and just practice. Hard. He screamed again, made them skate until their lungs burned. "Do you think you're good now?" he barked. "You're not. You're just less bad than you used to be." Some grumbled, but most understood, because Brooks wasn't punishing them. He was protecting the miracle before it could be stillborn. He knew they had the pieces. Now he had to make sure they stayed sharp. The semi-final slot was now official. They would play the Soviets. It was no longer a fantasy, it was a calendar entry. And that changed everything. Jim Craig didn't sleep well that week. He replayed the 10-3 loss from Madison Square Garden in his mind, frame by frame. Not to fear it, to own it. He dissected every goal, memorized every weakness. Tretiak wasn't a statue. Makarov wasn't a god. They bled. They blinked. They could be touched. Erucione, for his part, quieted down. No speeches, no jokes. He started watching tapes alone long after the others had gone to bed. Not because he was obsessed, but because he felt responsible. This team wasn't just skating anymore. It was carrying a weight, a dream, a nation. And the dream was trembling under its own size. Back home, something surreal happened. The public had stopped waiting for the miracle. They had started expecting it. Kids sent letters, veterans sent flags. Churches held prayer circles. New York Times ran a feature headlined, "Can these kids save us all?" Brooks taped it to the locker room wall. Not to inspire, to warn. "Do not read this crap," he said. "This is how dreams die, in headlines, in noise." But the players didn't crumble. They tightened. The brotherhood, once fragile, now sealed shut. Buzz Schneider stopped joking before games. Mark Johnson, calm, calculating, took over face-offs with the stare of a surgeon. O'Callahan's knee barely held, but he refused to sit. "You'll have to cut it off," he told the trainers. No one laughed, because no one doubted it. By the end of group play, the USA team had outscored their opponents 27-11. But it wasn't the numbers that mattered. It was the feeling of inevitability. They were no longer asking if they belonged. They were asking what else they could take. And standing between them and immortality, again, was the Red Wall. The Soviet Union. The same team that crushed them in Manhattan. The same team that hadn't lost an Olympic game in 12 years. Now came the moment, not the miracle, the chance to earn one. Lake Placid woke up frozen. Not just from the snow that had fallen steadily all night, but from the hush that hung in the air, as if the town itself was holding its breath. February 22nd, 1980. The day America would meet the Red Machine, not in theory, not in exhibition, but on Olympic ice, under the weight of real consequence. The locker room was quiet. No speeches, no chest thumping, just silence. Not awkward, but sacred. The kind of silence that surrounds something enormous, something people know even if they don't speak it, will echo long after they're gone. Jim Craig sat alone, taping his stick with perfect symmetry. Left hand steady, right hand tight. Each rap precise. He didn't need music. He didn't want it. He needed the rhythm of his own thoughts, the sound of fabric stretching, the smell of old sweat and fresh ice. Mike Erusione paced. He wasn't nervous. He was electric. The kind of energy that didn't shake hands, it shook souls. He wasn't the biggest guy in the room, but in that moment, every eye found him when they drifted. Not because he demanded it, because he carried something the others needed to borrow. Joy, belief, fire. Herb Brooks was last to enter. He didn't slam the door, didn't bark. He just stood, arms folded, eyes scanning the room like a general before battle, not to intimidate, but to see. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't a speech. It was a whisper that cut through bone. If you lose this game, you'll take it to your graves. A pause. To your graves. No tactics, no boards. Just that. The room didn't erupt. It vibrated. They pulled on their jerseys slowly, like armor. Each stitch mattered now. Each color was louder. White, red, blue, not just symbols anymore. Identity, purpose, a declaration. Outside, the world began to arrive. Journalists elbowed for space. Cameramen tested their lenses. Security tightened. And in the stands, people from everywhere, carrying flags, wearing buttons, mouthing prayers. Parents, coaches, children, veterans, strangers, all united by hope they barely understood. The Soviets arrived in silence. Their bus rolled in like a military column. No smiles, no waves, just focused faces behind thick coats. They didn't need to posture. They were already legends, winners of the last 4 Olympic golds, undefeated for 12 years. They didn't believe in miracles because they had never needed one. Their warm-up was mechanical. Pucks passed in lines, sticks moving in perfect time, like a ballet of steel and frost. Even their sweat looked planned. By contrast, the Americans looked chaotic. Passes missed, shots sailed. The nerves were real, but underneath it, fire. The kind that doesn't show up on a stat sheet. The kind that burns through fear. Al Michaels adjusted his mic in the press box. He didn't know yet that his voice would become immortal. He was just trying to stay professional, keep the moment under control. Frank Gifford beside him tapped the desk nervously. They all knew. This wasn't just a hockey game. It was a standoff between two worlds, between empire and rebellion, between inevitability and faith. In the final moments before the game, Craig closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about Tretiak or Makarov or Karlamov. He was thinking about his mom, who died the year before. About her smile. About the promise he made to do something big, something she'd be proud of. Erusione found Mark Johnson and gave him a nod. "Let's go mess this up." He grinned. Johnson didn't smile back. He just tightened his grip and said, "Yeah." The doors opened, and the roar swallowed them. Not just cheers, not just applause. A roar, deep and alive, like it had come from the earth itself. The crowd wasn't just watching. It was praying out loud. The anthem played. Some sang, some cried. Some stared forward, fists clenched. Then the puck dropped. And everything would change. From the first second, the game cracked with tension. Not the kind you hear, but the kind you feel. In your neck, in your stomach, in the way your fingers grip things tighter without you noticing. The Soviets moved like dancers. Quick cuts, short passes, unblinking eyes. It was a machine doing what it was built to do. And yet, it wasn't perfect. 30 seconds in, Mark Johnson poked the puck loose at center ice. It bounced awkwardly, slid toward Erusione, but just beyond his reach. A flicker. A warning. The red machine wasn't invincible. It could misfire. Then came the first Soviet goal. Vladimir Krutov, like a blade through silk, redirected a slapshot past Jim Craig before anyone could react. 1-0, silence. Only for a second, but enough to feel it. Enough for every American fan to remember. This is what they do. They score early. They suffocate. They win. But the silence didn't last. Buzz Schneider answered minutes later. A wrist shot from the left side, low and sneaky, beat Tretiak. The crowd erupted. 1-1. It wasn't just a goal. It was defiance. But then, Tretiak woke up, and the Soviets pressed. Craig made save after save, body stretched like a net of nerves. But just before the first period ended, Makarov hammered one in. 2-1. That should have been the story, but it wasn't. Because Herb Brooks made the boldest call of the night, without touching the ice. Soviet coach Tikhonov, furious with Tretiak for allowing Schneider's goal, pulled him, replaced him with Mishkin. The world blinked. Tretiak was the best goalie alive. And now, benched? The shift rippled. Team USA felt it first. Not relief, but recognition. Even they can panic. And then the second period began. It was chaos. Soviets attacked like a swarm. Pucks flew, bodies collided. Jim Craig was everywhere. Left, right, up, sprawled. His pads sounded like drums. Then, something unreal. Late in the second, the puck bounced free in the Soviet zone. Mark Johnson charged, untouched. He reached it, deked, and slipped it under Mishkin. 2-2. Bedlam. The arena rocked, and the period ended. Tied, 20 minutes to go. A new game now, no script, no legacy, just breath, sweat, and steel. The third period opened, and it happened. Mike Erusione took a pass at the top of the slot. A space no Soviet should have left open. But there it was. He didn't hesitate. He fired. The puck split the air like a promise kept. Goal. 3-2. Pandemonium. Eruzione raised both arms, mouth wide open, a scream lost in the roar of 1,000 others. Brooks didn't move. He stared at the clock. 10 minutes left. That goal didn't end the game. It began the longest 10 minutes in American sports history. The Soviets attacked. Again. 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 Craig became a myth. He blocked shots with his chest, his glove, his mask. One save cracked the crossbar. Another he didn't even see, but caught anyway. His teammates cleared rebounds like their lives depended on it. Because in a way, they did. Every second felt like a cliff edge. Time slowed. The crowd counted the final minutes out loud. 5 minutes, 3, 2, and then, do you believe in miracles? Al Michaels' voice pierced the moment like lightning. Yes! The horn sounded. The bench emptied. Sticks flew, helmets soared. Erusione tackled Craig. Craig wept behind his mask. Brooks disappeared down the tunnel, alone, quiet. He wanted it to be their moment, not his. Around the country, people screamed at their TVs. Dads lifted kids in the air. Strangers hugged. Bartenders cried. Soldiers saluted. Teachers paused class. History teachers took notes. It wasn't just a win. It was a resurrection of faith, of spirit, of the belief that sometimes, just sometimes, everything impossible becomes real. That night, the American locker room was chaos and calm. Yelling, laughing, weeping, but also sitting, just sitting, soaking it in. Craig held the flag draped over his shoulders like a cape. O'Callahan limped into a chair and didn't move. Erusione hugged everyone, then disappeared into a corner and cried alone. Brooks reappeared for only a moment. No words, just one look. Pride without smile. Then he was gone again. Because he knew it wasn't over. One game remained. Gold wasn't yet in their hands. But this was something gold could never buy. A miracle. The night after the Soviet game, Lake Placid didn't sleep. Not really. People wandered the streets in disbelief, some crying, some laughing, some just repeating the score to anyone who'd listen. 4-3. Not in a dream. Not in a movie. In real life. But inside the Olympic Village, Team USA didn't celebrate long. Because Herb Brooks didn't let them. He walked into the locker room after the greatest upset in sports history and barely paused. "If you lose to Finland on Sunday," he said, eyes burning, "you'll take that to your graves too." The message was brutal, but true. The gold wasn't theirs yet, and Brooks knew how easy it was to fall asleep in your own applause. The Finnish team wasn't mythical like the Soviets, but they were sharp, disciplined, fast, and most dangerous of all, they had nothing to lose. For the Americans, the burden had shifted. They were no longer the scrappy underdog. They were the team the world now expected to win. That terrified Brooks. So he turned up the heat. Saturday was short and sharp. No press, no distractions, just skating and systems. Craig stayed late, like always. Eruzione paced in silence, a stark contrast to his usual fire. Everyone felt it now. The dream had changed shape. It was no longer about shocking the world. It was about finishing the story. Game day came, Sunday, February 24th. The arena buzzed, but not like before. This wasn't mythology. This was business. Medals would be awarded today. Glory would be finalized. But first, they had to win. The game started. Badly. Finland struck first, then again. 2-1. Panic whispered through the crowd. And on the bench, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Brooks paced behind them, arms crossed, face tight. No yelling this time, just watching, measuring. The players were tight. Passes missed, decisions lagged. It looked like the clock had turned midnight on the miracle. But then, something shifted. Not from the bench. From within. Dave Christian stepped up first. A shot from the point, redirected chaos in front. Goal. Tie game. Then Johnson. A laser past the Finnish goalie's glove. 3-2. And finally, Schneider. The puck found him at the right circle. One move, one shot. 4-2. That was it. The arena exploded again, but it was different this time. Not a scream of disbelief. A scream of completion. The miracle had become a mission, and the mission was finished. When the horn blew, there was no dogpile this time. No chaos, just stillness. The players hugged. Some wept. Others just stood, looking at the scoreboard like it was a sunrise. Brooks stood behind the bench, arms crossed, nodding slowly. Then he turned and walked down the tunnel again. Same as before, because this too was their moment, not his. The medal ceremony was pure Americana. The crowd chanted USA in waves over and over like an oath. Craig held his flag again. Eruzione couldn't stop smiling. Johnson stared up at the roof, blinking fast. When the anthem played, they didn't just hear it, they felt it. And this time, no one doubted that they belonged there. Gold around their necks. Not borrowed, earned. Every second of sweat, every broken stick, every bruise, it had led to this. A podium not just of metal and steps, but of meaning. Back home, the country erupted. Bars played the replay on a loop. Teachers changed lesson plans. The president made a phone call. And somewhere in every town, someone whispered, "Did you see it? Did you believe it?" Because it wasn't just hockey anymore. It was us, our doubts, our hope, our grit, frozen in time. And the scoreboard that said it all, USA Nelia Suomi Kaksi, gold. When the lights dimmed in Lake Placid and the crowds drifted home, the silence felt almost surreal. The games were over. The medals had been handed out. The miracle was complete. But for those who lived it, from the players to the fans to the millions watching on grainy TVs, it wasn't over at all. It was just beginning. Some stories fade as soon as the final whistle blows. This one did the opposite. It echoed. The players returned to a country that no longer saw them as amateurs or kids from college rinks. They were heroes now, and not the kind made by contracts or endorsements, but by something rarer: belief. Genuine, raw, collective belief. The kind you don't choose. The kind that grabs you. Jim Craig went home to Massachusetts and found himself flooded with letters. Thousands, from widows, from veterans, from children. One asked if he'd come to her school. Another just said, "Thank you for making my dad cry." He didn't know what to say, because he hadn't meant to be anything. He just stopped pucks. And now strangers were calling him America. Mike Erucione didn't play another game of pro hockey. He didn't need to. His name was etched into the country's bloodstream like a chorus. Every time someone whispered, "Do you believe in miracles?" they were whispering him. Herb Brooks went back to coaching, of course. But something had changed. He wasn't just the guy with the drills and the riddles anymore. He was the man who did the impossible. The man who bent time. And even when he tried to talk about systems or forechecks, people only wanted to hear about that night. Years passed, and the myth grew. Not because anyone lied, but because no one had to. Reality had already outwritten fiction. Books were written, films were made. Speeches borrowed its rhythm. Politicians quoted Michaels. Classrooms studied the tactics. Churches mentioned it in sermons. It wasn't just a sports story anymore. It was American scripture. But behind the glory, life moved on. Some players struggled to adjust. Some slipped back into anonymity. Some tried for the NHL and found it wasn't waiting. They were 20-somethings who had peaked before rent payments. Not all of them wore the gold comfortably. Fame, it turned out, didn't come with a manual. But what they shared, what no one could ever take, was the bond. They still called each other, still gathered, still joked about Brooks behind his back, the way you do with someone you both feared and loved. At reunions, they told the same stories. And somehow, they never got old. In 2002, at the Salt Lake City Olympics, the team was honored. All older now, grayer, softer around the edges. But the magic was still there. The crowd stood for 5 full minutes, and not a single player fidgeted. Because they felt it too. That the world hadn't forgotten. That somehow time had folded, and for one night, they were 22 again, skating toward something impossible. When Herb Brooks died in a car accident the following year, it hit like thunder. Quiet, sudden, irreversible. His funeral was packed, but still felt too small. Because how do you bury a myth? His players spoke. They didn't cry much. That wasn't their way. But you could hear it in their voices. That empty chair behind the bench. Forever. And on his tombstone, the words weren't grand, just simple. He believed in miracles. Today, when people talk about Lake Placid, they talk with reverence. Even those who weren't alive. It's passed down like a campfire story. Because it matters. Because in a world that often teaches us to be cynical, to hedge our hopes, to avoid heartbreak, the miracle on ice said, "Dream anyway." It said, "Try." It said, "You never know." The grainy footage still gives people chills. Michael's voice still raises the hair on the back of your neck. The jersey still hangs in museums like it belongs next to the Constitution. Because maybe it does. Because maybe, just maybe, those 60 minutes on Olympic ice were more than a game. Maybe they were proof that courage matters, that unity matters, that sometimes, just sometimes, the underdog wins. And when they do, the whole world remembers, forever.